One night was all he agreed to, but Leonard refused to let George leave. Trapped between desire and danger, George must face the man who holds both his fear and his heart. Will surrender lead to love, or something far more forbidden? Subscribe, like, and comment to follow this intense BL story. George had never been to a place like the Obsidian Room. From the outside, it looked like any high-end bar tucked into the quiet part of the city. Mirrored windows, discreet lighting, no sign above the door. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew this wasn't just another social club. The air carried something electric, something whispered and forbidden. He wasn't there to play. Not really. He was there because of a deadline. The editor at the Chronicle wanted a feature about the hidden desires of the city's elite. It sounded sensational, shallow even, but it paid, and George needed rent. So, dressed in a borrowed suit and armed with curiosity, he wandered into a place that promised secrecy. A hostess met him with a practiced smile. "Name, sir?" "George Fenton," he replied, trying not to sound nervous. His voice came out a little rough, like he hadn't used it all day. The hostess glanced at the guest list, then at him. Her expression softened slightly, as if she saw right through his nervousness. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Fenton. You're in safe hands here." Safe? He almost laughed at the word. He hadn't felt safe in months. Not since Daniel left. Not since he'd begun measuring his worth by unread messages and cold coffee cups. The music inside was low, like a heartbeat. People spoke in hushed tones, eyes glimmering behind masks of confidence. In the corner, couples whispered and laughed. It was beautiful and intimidating, like walking into someone else's dream. He moved toward the bar, intending to order something that would make him look composed. Before he could, a man's voice, deep, steady, unhurried, spoke from behind him. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here." George turned, startled. The man leaning against the bar had a kind of effortless presence that didn't need attention to command it. Broad shoulders, dark hair brushed back neatly, an expression that was calm but unreadable. He wore no mask, no name tag, just quiet confidence that filled the room. "I'm new," George admitted, instinctively straightening his jacket. "Just curious." The man's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Curiosity can be dangerous here." "I'm a journalist," George blurted out, before realizing it was the worst possible thing to say in a place built on anonymity. Instead of anger, the man gave a low, quiet laugh. "Honest? I like that." He extended a hand. "Leonard." George hesitated before shaking it. Leonard's hand was warm, his grip firm but not crushing. There was a steadiness to him, something grounding. "George," he said softly. "George," Leonard repeated, tasting the name like it mattered. "You're trembling." "I'm not," but he was. He'd been trembling since he walked in. Leonard tilted his head, studying him. "You're not used to letting go, are you?" George frowned. "Letting go. Control," Leonard murmured. "People come here for many reasons. Some want to dominate. Some want to be free. You look like someone who's forgotten what freedom feels like." His words struck too close. George opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Leonard didn't press. He simply ordered 2 drinks, then gestured toward a quieter section of the club where the lighting dimmed to amber. "Join me." No expectations. Just conversation. Something about the way he said it, steady without demand, made George follow. They sat across from each other, the soft hum of jazz filling the silence. Leonard's presence wasn't suffocating, it was steady like an anchor. "So," Leonard began, "you came here to write?" "Yes." "About the kind of people who—" George trailed off. He couldn't bring himself to finish. Leonard chuckled quietly. "Who pay for what the world doesn't understand?" "Something like that." Leonard leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe you should understand it first. Experience it." George's breath caught. "You mean?" "One night," Leonard said. "My rules. You can end it any time you want. No one will touch you, no one will hurt you. You'll be safe." George's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Every instinct screamed no. But another voice, softer, desperate, whispered maybe. He'd been tired of always being the one in control, of pretending to be fine, of holding his world together with shaking hands. Maybe one night of letting someone else hold the reins wasn't as terrifying as it sounded. What would it mean? George asked quietly. Leonard's gaze softened. "It means you trust me to lead. Nothing more, nothing less." George looked at his hands. "And if I say yes? Then I take care of you," Leonard said simply. "For one night." Something in the gentleness of that promise undid him. He nodded. "Yes." Leonard didn't smile. He just reached across the table and brushed his knuckles against George's cheek, slow and deliberate. The touch wasn't about claiming, it was about asking. The rest of the night unfolded not in shadows but in warmth. Leonard didn't rush. Every touch, every word was an unspoken question. Is this all right? And George found himself answering yes more than once. There was no performance, no pretense. Just quiet surrender. When Leonard held him, it wasn't dominance, it was reassurance. When he guided George to breathe, to relax, to let go, George felt something he hadn't in years: safety. It wasn't about submission. It was about trust. Time blurred. The music faded. Somewhere between midnight and morning, George stopped thinking about the article. He stopped thinking at all. When he finally stirred awake, soft dawn light spilled across the room. Leonard sat by the window, sipping coffee, looking out over the city. George's first thought was that he should leave before things became complicated. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Thank you for last night," he murmured. "I should go." Leonard turned, his expression unreadable. Then softer, "You don't have to." George froze. "What?" Leonard stood, walking over slowly. His eyes, for the first time, looked uncertain. "You don't have to leave yet. You don't look ready to face the world." "I can't just stay here," George whispered. "You can," Leonard replied gently. "At least for breakfast." It should have sounded controlling. It didn't. It sounded like concern. Like an offer he didn't deserve. George hesitated. Then nodded once. Leonard smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't practiced but real. "Good. Then let's start with coffee." And as the sun rose higher, George realized that maybe for the first time in years, someone wasn't asking him to be strong. Someone was just asking him to stay. He didn't know what the morning would bring or what it meant to linger in a stranger's world. But for now, that small moment of peace was enough. And when Leonard looked at him again, with eyes both kind and commanding, George felt a quiet, terrifying truth settle deep in his chest. He wasn't sure he wanted to leave. George had always thought silence was lonely. But here in Leonard's penthouse, it was something else entirely. The room was too peaceful, muted sunlight spilling across marble floors, the faint hum of an espresso machine somewhere in the distance, the soft tick of a clock that sounded far too calm for how fast his heart was beating. He'd meant to leave. He'd even reached for his shoes. But Leonard had a way of making stillness feel like safety. Now, George sat at the kitchen island, barefoot and awkward, while Leonard poured coffee into 2 porcelain cups like it was the most natural thing in the world. He wasn't wearing the formal suit from last night, just a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up, dark hair slightly tousled. The domesticity of it felt surreal. Leonard placed a cup in front of him. "Cream? Sugar?" "Just black," George murmured, then took a sip. The warmth spread through him slowly, melting away the tension that had built up overnight. For a while neither spoke. Leonard leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching the morning light drift across the room. "You don't look like someone who writes about secret clubs," Leonard said finally, breaking the silence. George blinked. "How do I look then?" "Like someone who writes about broken people trying to find themselves," Leonard replied softly. "But maybe I'm just projecting." George gave a small laugh, though it felt more like an exhale. "That's not too far off, actually. Did you find what you were looking for last night?" Leonard asked. George met his gaze. "I think I found something. I just don't know what it is yet." A faint smile tugged at Leonard's lips. "Then maybe stay until you figure it out." There it was again, that quiet insistence, not controlling, not demanding, just steady. Like Leonard wasn't used to asking people to stay but didn't want to see them leave either. George hesitated. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Leonard tilted his head as if the question genuinely puzzled him. "Do I need a reason to be kind?" "Yes," George said softly. "People always have reasons." Leonard's expression flickered. Something unreadable passed through his eyes before he turned away. "Maybe I just like your silence," he said at last. "It's honest." That answer didn't make sense, but it comforted George anyway. They spent the morning in quiet conversation, Leonard asking questions in his calm, measured voice, about George's work, his favorite books, the cities he'd lived in. Nothing too personal but always just deep enough to feel seen. And George, against every instinct he'd built over the years, began to answer truthfully. He told Leonard about his journalism degree, about the articles no one wanted to publish, about Daniel, the man who'd made him believe in love, and the betrayal that had hollowed him out when it ended. Leonard listened without interruption. When George's voice faltered, he didn't offer pity, only stillness. It was strange how that helped more than words ever could. At one point, George noticed a faint scar along Leonard's wrist, barely visible under the rolled sleeve. He wanted to ask, but something in Leonard's posture warned him not to. By late afternoon, the city outside had turned gold. Leonard had gone to take a call in the study, leaving George by the window. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, sharp, glittering, alive. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he looked at something beautiful without feeling empty. He should leave now, he thought. Before this started to feel like something it wasn't. Before the soft warmth of the room made him forget that Leonard was a stranger. He stood, grabbed his jacket, then stopped. A faint melody drifted through the air. Piano. Slow, deliberate notes that felt almost fragile. It was coming from the study. Curiosity tugged at him. Quietly he walked toward the half-open door and peered in. Leonard sat at the piano, his hands moving gracefully over the keys, head slightly bowed. The music was mournful, beautiful, but steeped in something raw. George couldn't move. The man who had seemed so composed now looked heartbreakingly human. When the last note faded, Leonard exhaled and leaned back, eyes closed. "That piece," George said softly from the doorway. "It's sad." Leonard didn't startle. "It's not meant to be," he replied without turning. "But I suppose I never learned to play it any other way." George stepped inside. "What's it called?" Leonard's fingers brushed the keys. "A promise." He turned, then meeting George's gaze. For a heartbeat, the air between them shifted. Something deeper, unspoken, humming quietly beneath the surface. Leonard stood and crossed the room. "You were going to leave," he said quietly. "I was," George admitted. "But then I heard you play." Leonard smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed serious. "And now?" George hesitated. "Now I don't know." Leonard stopped close enough that George could feel his warmth. "Then don't decide yet." There was a pause, long and full of things neither dared to say. George's voice was barely a whisper. "You make it sound so easy to stay." Leonard's reply was softer still. "It isn't easy for me either." That night George stayed. Not because Leonard asked him to, but because something in him wanted to understand the man behind the calm, behind the soft eyes and the unspoken sorrow. Dinner was simple: grilled fish, a glass of wine, quiet conversation that felt like home. Later they sat on the couch, a comfortable silence between them. Leonard read, glasses perched low on his nose. George watched the city lights outside, trying not to think about how natural it felt to share space with him. When George began to drift, Leonard set the book aside and said softly, "You can sleep in the guest room tonight." "I don't want to intrude." "You're not," Leonard interrupted. "You need rest. Let the world wait until morning." It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. George nodded. "All right." He rose, but as he passed Leonard, their hands brushed briefly. A small, accidental touch, but it felt electric, grounding. Leonard looked up. Their eyes met, steady, unguarded. "Good night, George." "Good night," he whispered back. As he lay in the guest bed later, staring at the ceiling, George realized something unsettling. He'd known Leonard less than 24 hours, yet the thought of leaving in the morning already made his chest ache. He turned toward the window where the moonlight spilled across the floor and closed his eyes. He didn't know what Leonard was hiding behind that calm, but he wanted to find out. Not for an article. Not for curiosity. For himself. And somewhere in the dark, a thought whispered through his mind, quiet but certain. Maybe the safest place isn't one you find. It's someone who makes you stop running. Morning came with the scent of rain. George woke to the rhythmic patter against the windows, the soft hum of the city muted beneath it. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. Then he saw the pale gray sheets, the quiet luxury of the guest room, and the faint aroma of coffee drifting down the hall. "Leonard." He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't slept this deeply in months. The nightmares that usually pulled him from sleep, voices, memories, Daniel's last message, had been replaced by stillness. A foreign, fragile peace. He followed the scent to the kitchen, where Leonard stood by the window, wearing the same white shirt from yesterday, unbuttoned at the collar. The morning light hit him softly, outlining the edges of someone both real and unreachable. "Good morning," Leonard said, turning with a faint smile. "You slept through the storm." George rubbed his eyes. "You didn't." "I don't sleep much," Leonard admitted. "Coffee?" George nodded, accepting the mug. Their fingers brushed briefly. That simple touch sent a strange comfort through him. They stood side by side in silence, watching raindrops streak down the glass. For a while neither spoke. It was Leonard who finally broke the stillness. "I used to love mornings like this," he murmured. When I was younger, rain felt like the world washing itself clean. Now it just feels heavy. George turned to him, curious. What changed? Leonard's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his usual calm. Life. Choices. Regrets. Something in his tone made George's chest tighten. You talk like someone carrying too much. Leonard gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Maybe I am. He turned, leaning against the counter. Do you remember what I told you that first night? That you looked like someone who'd forgotten what freedom feels like. George nodded. I said that, Leonard continued softly, because I know what it looks like. I've lived it. George's breath caught. You mean? Leonard's gaze met his, steady but shadowed. There was someone before you. Someone I loved more than I should have. He paused as if the words hurt to form. His name was Adrian. The name hung between them, fragile and echoing. Leonard turned back toward the rain. We met in this same world, the club, the contracts, the rules. But with him it stopped being about control. He was young, impulsive, and had this way of smiling like the world couldn't touch him. I thought I could protect him from everything. His voice faltered slightly and George's chest ached at the sound. What happened? Leonard exhaled slowly. I failed him. He was struggling, mentally, emotionally, but I didn't see it. I thought giving him structure, control, boundaries would help. But what he needed was something I'd forgotten how to give, freedom. The night he left, he didn't come back. George didn't move. He didn't speak. He just let Leonard's silence fill the space between them. When Leonard finally looked at him, his eyes were glassy but resolute. Since then I stopped letting people close. I stopped trusting myself to care. Until you. George swallowed hard. Leonard? You remind me of him, Leonard said, voice barely above a whisper. Not because you look alike. Because you're fragile in the same quiet way. You carry too much alone. George took a step closer. I'm not him. I know, Leonard replied quickly, shaking his head. But when I saw you that night, standing in that room, pretending you belonged there, I saw the same kind of pain I used to hide behind calm smiles. And I couldn't walk away. The words sank into George's chest like rain soaking into dry earth. He should have felt angry. He should have felt used. But instead he felt seen. Completely, terrifyingly seen. I came there to write a story, George whispered. To watch people from the outside. But you, he exhaled shakily. You looked at me like I was something worth staying for. Leonard's voice softened. Because you are. The space between them dissolved. For a heartbeat, the world outside disappeared, the rain, the city, the past. There was only the quiet sound of two people who had spent too long pretending not to need anyone. Leonard reached out, slowly, giving George time to pull away. When he didn't, Leonard's hand came to rest against his cheek. His thumb brushed a tear George hadn't realized had fallen. You don't owe me anything, Leonard said. You don't have to stay. I just needed you to know why I wanted to protect you. George leaned into his touch, eyes fluttering shut. Maybe I don't need protection. Maybe I just need someone who doesn't run when things get hard. Leonard smiled faintly, a sadness and warmth mingling in his eyes. Then stay. Not as my submissive. Not as someone to fix. Just stay as yourself. That single word, stay, felt heavier than any chain could. George nodded, barely trusting his voice. All right. The rest of the day unfolded quietly, like a fragile truce between two broken hearts. Leonard showed him his art collection, abstract pieces full of soft colors and hidden meanings. George read aloud from one of his favorite books while Leonard listened, his expression calm but intent. Every small gesture, every shared silence began to feel like healing. When night came, Leonard cooked again. Simple pasta, wine, the faint glow of candlelight flickering between them. At one point, George reached across the table and covered Leonard's hand with his own. You did everything you could for him, he said quietly. You didn't fail him. You just couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. Leonard looked at him for a long time. And you? Do you want to be saved? George smiled sadly. No. I just want to live without feeling like I'm still running from something. Then let's start there, Leonard murmured. They talked long into the night, about love, regret, forgiveness, and the strange comfort of finding someone who understands the weight you carry without trying to take it away. And when George finally drifted to sleep on the couch, Leonard watched him for a long time, his heart both heavy and light. He whispered softly, almost to himself, this time I won't lose him. Outside the rain had stopped. The city glowed faintly beneath the clouds, and for the first time in years, Leonard felt something break quietly open inside him. Not grief. Not guilt. It had been a week since George first walked into the obsidian room. A week since one night became a quiet, unexpected chapter in his life that he hadn't meant to write. He'd told himself he'd leave in the morning. Then after breakfast. Then after the rain stopped. But somehow mornings turned into evenings and Leonard's penthouse had begun to feel less like a stranger's space and more like sanctuary. The kind of peace that sneaks up on you when you stop trying to deserve it. George sat by the wide glass window, wrapped in one of Leonard's gray sweaters, watching the city blink awake beneath the dawn. The sky was pale blue, the world washed clean after days of rain. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of footsteps. Leonard. He appeared with 2 mugs of coffee, hair still damp from a shower, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up. He looked more relaxed these days, less guarded, the corners of his mouth quicker to lift when he caught George smiling. "Morning," Leonard said, setting a cup beside him. "Morning," George replied softly. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee, watching the city breathe. Leonard was the one who spoke first. "You've been quiet lately." George smiled faintly. "You say that like I'm not always quiet." Leonard chuckled under his breath. "Quieter than usual, then?" George traced a finger along the rim of his cup. "I've been thinking about leaving." Leonard's movements stilled. He set his cup down gently, not looking at him right away. "I know. You do. I've been waiting for you to say it," Leonard admitted. "You've been walking around here like someone packing invisible bags." George exhaled a shaky laugh. "You always see right through me." "Only because I've learned to look," Leonard said softly. Silence settled again, heavier now. The truth was simple but sharp. George couldn't stay here forever. He had work waiting and unfinished life outside these walls. And yet, the thought of leaving Leonard, of losing the quiet, the steady warmth, the way his presence slowed George's heartbeat, felt like pulling oxygen from his lungs. "I don't want to go," George whispered. "But I'm afraid if I stay, I'll forget how to live on my own again." Leonard finally turned to him. His expression wasn't hurt, it was tender. "Understanding. Then you should go. You've already learned what you needed to." George frowned. "What do you mean?" "You came here afraid of being seen," Leonard said gently. "Now you let me look. You came here exhausted and now you sleep through the night. You came here empty and now," he reached out, brushing his thumb over George's wrist. "Now you breathe again." George felt tears gather at the edge of his vision. "You make it sound like you're trying to convince me to leave." "I am," Leonard said with a small, bittersweet smile. "Because you deserve a world that isn't limited to these walls." George laughed softly, though his voice trembled. "You always do this. You talk like you're some chapter I'm supposed to close." Leonard shook his head. "Not close. Carry with you." That broke something inside George, not in a painful way but in a freeing one. He set his coffee aside and looked at Leonard fully. "And what about you? What happens when I walk out that door?" Leonard gave a faint shrug. "I'll keep living. Maybe I'll start playing piano again. Maybe I'll finally open the windows and let the world in." George smiled through his tears. "That sounds lonely." "Not if I know you're out there," Leonard said simply. It was such an honest, quiet answer that it pulled the air from George's lungs. He didn't remember standing up, but suddenly he was close. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating off Leonard's chest, close enough to see the soft lines around his eyes when he smiled. "Leonard," George whispered, "I don't know what this is between us. I don't have a name for it." Leonard's voice was low. "Then don't name it. Just feel it." George reached up, fingers trembling slightly as they brushed along Leonard's jaw. Leonard leaned into the touch, eyes fluttering shut. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then George rose on his toes and kissed him. It wasn't desperate or hungry, it was quiet, deliberate, full of gratitude and ache and something fragile that had bloomed between them when they weren't looking. When they parted, Leonard rested his forehead against George's. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me what it feels like to care without fear." George smiled. "And thank you for teaching me that surrender doesn't have to mean loss." They stood like that for a long time, the city slowly brightening behind them. Finally George stepped back. "I'll come back," he said softly. Leonard's eyes met his. "Only if you want to." "I will," George promised. He walked toward the door, shoes in hand. Then, on impulse, he turned and crossed to the small wooden box on the table. The one Leonard had shown him days ago, the one that held the collar from their first night. George picked it up, opened it and placed the simple leather band on the table, not as rejection but as symbol. "Keep it," he said. "It reminds me of who I was that night, and who I'm not anymore." Leonard's eyes softened. "And who are you now?" George smiled through a shimmer of tears. Someone who chooses. He walked to the door, pausing just before he stepped out. Goodbye, Leonard. Not goodbye, Leonard said gently. Just until you're ready to come home again. George nodded once, then stepped into the hallway. The door closed softly behind him. Outside, the morning air was crisp, full of city noise and life. For the first time in a long while, George didn't flinch at it. He inhaled deeply, the world feeling wide and possible again. He looked up at the sky, smiling faintly. He had come searching for a story. He had found one, but not the kind that would ever be printed. This one would live quietly in his heart, in the way he walked a little lighter, breathed a little deeper, loved a little braver. And somewhere, several floors above, Leonard stood by the window, watching the small figure disappear into the crowd. He smiled, not the kind that hides pain but the kind that lets go. The rain had stopped. The world had begun again. I was his submissive for a night. But in the end, we both learned that love is never about who holds the leash, it's about who dares to stay, even after being set free.